The laughter started the moment Jacob Hale walked through the saloon doors. He was old, 60, maybe older, with a back bent like a dry riverbed and hands so cracked and calloused they looked like saddle leather left in the sun too long. Dust lived permanently in the lines of his face. His boots were worn down to almost nothing at the heel. And beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, stood Clara Whitmore, the most talked-about widow in all of Redemption, Texas. "Well, I'll be damned," said a voice from the corner. "The old scarecrow's got himself a lady." More laughter. Loud, mean, the kind that fills a room and suffocates everything decent inside it. Jacob said nothing. He walked Clara to a table near the window, pulled out her chair like a gentleman, and sat down across from her. His eyes, pale gray, still and calm as winter water, moved once across the room. Just once. Nobody caught the look. Nobody thought to be afraid yet. That was their first mistake. The town of Redemption, Texas, had a way of eating men alive. It didn't do it with fangs or claws. Nothing so honest as that. It did it slowly, the way drought kills a field. First it took your water, then your crops, then your pride, and finally, if you stayed long enough, it took the very memory of who you used to be. Most men who came through Redemption either left rich or left broken. Very few left the same way they arrived. Jacob Hale had arrived 11 years ago on a Tuesday morning in October, riding a horse so old it looked embarrassed to still be alive. He carried one stool bag, one bedroll, and a name nobody recognized. Clara Whitmore's late husband, Robert, had hired him the same afternoon. Not because Jacob had impressive references or a strong handshake, but because Robert Whitmore was a practical man who recognized something useful when he saw it. "You know cattle?" Robert had asked, squinting from under the brim of a hat that had seen 20 Texas summers. "I know enough," Jacob had said. That was the entire interview. Jacob was given a bunk in the small room behind the barn, 3 meals a day, and a modest wage that he never once complained about. He worked from before sunrise till after sunset without fail, without drama, and without the kind of noise that most hired hands used to remind their employers they existed. He fixed fences that hadn't been touched in years. He nursed sick cattle back to health with a patience that bordered on supernatural. He rode the boundary lines in weather that kept every other man inside and warming his hands by the fire. The people of Redemption noticed him the way they noticed fence posts. Occasionally, briefly, and without much feeling. What they saw was an old man who kept to himself, a quiet presence on the Whitmore land who ate alone, spoke rarely, and never visited the saloon on Saturday nights like the younger hands did. Some of the men in town speculated about his past the way bored people speculate about everything, lazily and without much genuine curiosity. A few thought he might be a drifter running from something. Others figured he was simply one of those men the West produced in abundance, used up, forgotten, and grateful for any corner that would keep the rain off his head. Nobody thought he was dangerous. That was a mistake with deep roots. Robert Whitmore died 3 years after Jacob arrived. It was a quiet death. A heart that had been quietly failing for years finally decided it had done enough work. Robert was buried on the hill behind the house under a cottonwood tree he had planted the year he and Clara were married. Half the town came to the funeral. Jacob stood at the back, hat in hand, and said nothing to anyone. When the service ended and people gathered at the house for food and consolation, Jacob went back to the barn and repaired a section of wall that had been loose for a week. Clara noticed. She noticed because she was a woman who paid attention to the language of action rather than words. While a room full of people told her they were sorry for her loss, Jacob Hale went quietly back to work, making sure the place her husband had built would still be standing tomorrow. Over the following months, as the reality of running a ranch alone settled onto Clara's shoulders like a physical weight, Jacob simply expanded his work without being asked. He learned which suppliers Robert had trusted and which ones had been taking advantage. He kept the books straight. He managed the hands. 3 young men who respected him not because of any authority officially granted, but because of the economy of his movements, the certainty in his voice, and the quiet way he had of looking at a man that made conversation feel suddenly unnecessary. Clara paid him more. He accepted without comment. The town, watching this arrangement develop, drew the conclusions that small towns always draw. Talk moved through Redemption streets like tumbleweeds, purposeless but persistent. People suggested that Clara, still handsome at 44, might be lonely in ways that an old hired hand could conveniently address. The suggestions were not kind. They were the kind of talk that men produce when a woman dares to exist independently and successfully, and they needed to find some explanation for it that returned control to familiar hands. Clara ignored it. She had built enough of herself on the foundation of Robert's love that other people's opinions felt like rain against good stone, noisy, temporary, ultimately powerless. Jacob ignored it too, though in his case, those who knew how to read a man's stillness might have recognized that his ignoring was of a different quality entirely. Less like indifference, more like patience. The evening that everything changed began ordinarily enough. Clara had business in town, a matter with the land office that had been delayed twice already and could not be delayed again. She asked Jacob to accompany her. He put on his cleanest shirt, the dark one, and his good hat, and helped her into the wagon without a word. They rode into Redemption as the sun was dropping behind the mesa, painting the sky in colors that made the ugly parts of the town look almost beautiful. Jacob tied the horses at the rail outside the land office and waited while Clara went inside. He was leaning against the post, watching the street with those pale gray eyes, when a voice from across the road called out his name. Not his name exactly, but the shape of a taunt dressed up to look like one. "Hey, Scarecrow, your lady need you to hold her hand in there." Jacob turned his head slowly toward the sound. 3 men were sitting on the steps of the saloon across the street. Young men, or young enough. The kind of young that hasn't yet learned the difference between bravery and stupidity. The one who had spoken was grinning with all the confidence of someone who had never once been genuinely afraid of another human being. Jacob looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at the street. He said nothing. The young man laughed. His companions laughed. A few people on the sidewalk smiled, relieved that the entertainment was at someone else's expense. And then Clara came out of the land office, her business apparently incomplete, her expression carrying the particular frustration of a woman who has been given a runaround by men who don't take her seriously. She took Jacob's arm without thinking, a gesture so natural between them that neither noticed it. The saloon steps erupted. Jacob felt the laughter in the way you feel a splinter, small, specific, and located in a place you can't quite reach. He helped Clara back into the wagon. He untied the horses. He climbed up beside her. "We'll need to come back," Clara said quietly. "I know," Jacob said. He clicked the horses forward into the darkening street. Behind him, the laughter continued a moment longer, then dissolved into the sounds of a town settling into its evening. In the wagon, Clara's hand rested near his on the bench. Not touching, but near. Jacob's pale eyes stayed on the road ahead. He was thinking. There are things a woman learns about a man when she lives and works alongside him for 11 years that no amount of conversation could ever teach. Clara Whitmore had learned Jacob Hale the way she had learned the land. Slowly, carefully, through observation and patience and the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they genuinely value. She had learned that he took his coffee black and too hot, that he never ate until he was certain everyone else had been fed, that he checked the barn door twice every night before sleeping. Not from forgetfulness, but from discipline, from some internal standard that demanded things be done correctly the first time and verified the second. She had learned that he read. This had surprised her early on, finding him in the barn on winter evenings with a book propped against his knee, reading by lantern light with the focused intensity of a man doing serious work. She had never asked him about it. The books rotated, history, sometimes, and once a thick volume on military strategy that she had noticed but not commented on. Men like Jacob carried their histories in containers they chose carefully. She understood that asking him to open those containers before he was ready would only cause him to seal them tighter. What she had never told anyone, not her sister in San Antonio, not the preacher's wife who was her closest friend in Redemption, was what she had seen the first winter after Robert died. It had been December, cold enough that the ground rang like iron under a boot heel. 2 men had come to the ranch on a Thursday evening, riding horses that were too good for the kind of men sitting on them. They had knocked at the front door with the particular confidence of people who expect to be let in, and Clara had answered it alone because the hired hands were all in town and Jacob was, she thought, in the barn. The men were from a land company out of Dallas, or claimed to be. They had papers, official-looking but not quite official enough, and a proposition that amounted to Clara selling the Whitmore land at roughly half its value in exchange for a speedy transaction and the privilege of being rid of the burden of running it alone. The taller of the two men had made this proposition with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a hand that he rested on the doorframe in a way that was not quite threatening but was designed to remind her that he was larger than she was. Clara had been afraid. She would admit that, at least to herself. She had been genuinely afraid in a way she hadn't been since the early days of her marriage when the land itself had seemed hostile and indifferent to human survival. And then Jacob had appeared. He hadn't come from the barn, as it turned out. He had come from the darkness at the edge of the porch. How long he had been there she didn't know. And he had simply stepped into the lamplight and stood beside her. He said nothing at first. He looked at the two men with those pale gray eyes and he waited. The taller man's smile changed shape. "We were just having a conversation with the lady," he said. "I see that," Jacob said. Something in those 3 words rearranged the temperature of the entire porch. Clara felt it. Felt the shift the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. The two men felt it too. She could tell, because their bodies changed in the subtle ways that bodies change when they suddenly recalibrate a situation they thought they had fully understood. "She's not interested," Jacob said. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply a statement of fact delivered in a voice so completely certain that arguing with it would have felt like arguing with geography. The men left. They didn't hurry. They were too proud for that. But they left, and they didn't come back, and Clara noticed that they didn't look at Jacob directly as they walked to their horses. Later, after she had brought Jacob inside for coffee and he was sitting at her kitchen table with his hands wrapped around the mug, she had looked at him and said, "Who are you, Jacob?" He had considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "A man who works your land," he said finally. "That's not what I mean." He looked at his coffee. "I know," he said, and that had been the end of it. But Clara had seen his hands as he'd stood on that porch. She had noticed, in the lamplight, the way they had hung at his sides, loose, relaxed, in the particular way that hands are relaxed when their owner has made a specific kind of peace with what they are capable of. She had seen hands like that once before, on her father's oldest friend, a man who had ridden with the Texas Rangers for 20 years before a bullet in the knee retired him to a rocking chair in a garden. She had understood something then that she had filed away quietly, the way you file away information you don't yet know how to use. The night they returned from the land office, Clara made dinner while Jacob put the horses up. He came in smelling of hay and cold air and washed his hands at the basin by the door with the methodical thoroughness that was characteristic of everything he did. They ate together as they often did, in the comfortable silence of two people who had long since stopped needing conversation to fill space. The lamp on the table threw warm light across the room. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the mesquite trees with a sound like distant voices. "Those men today," Clara said, not looking up from her plate. "Yes," Jacob said. The one who spoke. "His name is Denton Cole. His father owns the stockyards on the south end of town and half the county commissioners." She paused. "Has never been told no by anyone who mattered." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Is that a warning?" Clara looked up at him then. In the lamplight, her face was calm, serious, the face of a woman who had survived enough to have earned her composure. "It's information," she said. "What you do with it is your business." Jacob nodded slowly. He looked at his plate, then at the dark window, then back at his food. "The land office," he said. "What did they tell you?" Clara set down her fork. "That the deed has a question mark on it. Someone, and they wouldn't say who, has filed a competing claim on the eastern 40 acres. They said I need documentation that Robert never filed properly." She said it evenly, but Jacob could hear the thin edge of anger beneath it, honed sharp by years of being a woman navigating systems built by men who preferred women to find them confusing. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "Robert filed that documentation," he said. "I was there. I drove him to the county office in November of the year before he died. I remember because it snowed that day, early snow, and Robert said it was a good omen." Clara looked at him steadily. Then someone has made it disappear. Yes, Jacob said. The words sat on the table between them like a stone. Jacob picked up his fork again. He ate the rest of his meal in silence. But Clara, who had learned to read the grammar of his silences the way a scholar reads a difficult text, understood that this particular silence was not empty. It was full. It was the silence of a decision being made, quietly and completely, in the way that Jacob Hale made all his decisions, without announcement, without drama, and without any possibility of being talked out of it. After dinner, he thanked her for the meal as he always did, took his hat from the hook by the door, and walked back out into the dark toward the barn. Clara cleared the table. She washed the dishes. She dried them and put them away. Then she sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the night. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel in the middle of trouble. She felt safe. Not because Jacob had promised her anything. Not because he had made declarations or beaten his chest or filled the room with the kind of loud confidence that men in redemption seemed to think women needed in order to feel protected. But because she knew, in the deep, quiet, certain way that 11 years of careful observation produces, exactly who Jacob Hale was beneath the worn boots and the cracked hands and the bent back. And she knew that Denton Cole, with all his father's money and all his borrowed authority, did not have the faintest idea what he had laughed at that afternoon. That ignorance, Clara thought, was going to cost him. Jacob Hale did not sleep that night. This was not unusual for him. Sleep had always been a negotiation rather than a surrender, something he approached carefully and on his own terms. But this particular sleeplessness had a different quality to it. It was purposeful. He lay on his bunk in the small room behind the barn, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, and let the past come back to him the way a man lets a river come back after a long drought, with full awareness of both its necessity and its danger. He had not thought about certain things in a very long time. That was deliberate. A man who has lived the kind of life Jacob had lived learns early that memory is not neutral territory. It has weight. It has pull. You can wall it off and live productively alongside those walls for years, even decades, if you are disciplined enough and if the life you have built on the other side of those walls is worth protecting. Jacob had been disciplined, and the life on the Whitmore land had been worth protecting, worth more to him, if he was honest, than he had ever expected any life to be worth again. But walls, he knew, did not make the thing behind them disappear. His name had not always been Jacob Hale. That was the beginning of it, the root from which everything else grew. He had taken the name 11 years ago in a town 300 miles east of Redemption, chosen from a gravestone in a churchyard because it belonged to a man who had died young and left no family to object to the borrowing. The name he had been born with, the name that had appeared in newspapers and wanted posters and the official correspondence of 3 separate territorial marshals, that name he had buried alongside everything else he was trying to leave behind. He had been, in that previous life, genuinely exceptional at one specific thing. Not ranching, not farming, not the quiet, patient work of maintaining land and livestock that had come to define his days in redemption. Those skills he had learned out of necessity and come to genuinely love for their honesty. The way the land asked nothing of you except effort and returned exactly what you gave. No, what Jacob had been exceptional at was a different kind of work entirely. He had ridden for 12 years as a deputy marshal under a man named Garrett Cross in the territories of New Mexico and Arizona. Before that, 2 years as a hired gun for a cattle outfit in Montana that operated in the gray area between legal and necessary. Before that, and this was the part he walled off most carefully, 4 years during the war that had left marks on him that no amount of subsequent peaceful living had fully erased. By the time he was 38 years old, Jacob, under his original name, had been in more gunfights than he could accurately count. He had counted, once, in a hotel room in Santa Fe on a night when the whiskey had made honesty seem manageable. He had stopped at 22 and put the bottle down and not picked it up again for 3 years. He was not proud of the number, but he was not dishonest about what the number meant, either. Each one of those 22 had been a man who had chosen, in the full possession of his faculties, to draw against Jacob and had discovered in the last moment available to him that this was a catastrophic miscalculation. Jacob had been fast. He had been fast the way certain natural phenomena are fast. not with effort or showmanship, but with a kind of absolute, unhurried certainty that bypassed the ordinary relationship between intention and action. Men who had watched him work described it afterward in the hushed, slightly bewildered tones of people who have witnessed something that doesn't quite fit inside their understanding of what human beings are capable of. Garrett Cross had called it a gift, which Jacob thought was a strange word for it. He had retired at 41 after a gunfight in a town called Mercy. The irony of the name had not been lost on him. That had left 2 men dead and Jacob with a bullet in his left shoulder that the doctor said had come within 3/4 of an inch of ending him entirely. He had lain in that doctor's bed for 2 weeks, staring at the ceiling of a stranger's house in a town he had never intended to visit, and decided with the calm clarity that near-death sometimes produces that he was finished. He had ridden east, changed his name, found Robert Whitmore's advertisement in a crumpled newspaper at a way station, and followed it to redemption like a man following the last trail marker in unfamiliar country. He sat up on his bunk at 3 in the morning and reached under the floorboard beneath his bed. The box was still there. It was always still there. He checked it periodically the way he checked the barn door, not from doubt but from discipline. A flat wooden box, unadorned, sealed with a simple latch. He set it on the bunk beside him and opened it in the darkness with the ease of long familiarity. Inside, nested in oiled cloth, were twin Colt single-action army revolvers. They were not the guns of a hired hand. They were the guns of a man who had once been paid serious money by serious people to go to serious places and handle situations that ordinary men could not handle. The finish on them was deep and even, maintained with the same patient attention Jacob gave to everything he valued. The grips were worn smooth in the specific places where a specific pair of hands had held them 10,000 times. The action on both was tuned to a precision that a gunsmith in Tucson had once described, with professional admiration, as bordering on the supernatural. Jacob held one in each hand in the darkness of his room. They were heavier than he remembered. Or perhaps he was simply more aware of their weight than he used to be, more aware of what weight meant. He sat with them for a long time. In the morning he was up before the sun as always, working through the ordinary rituals of the ranch day with his ordinary thoroughness. He fed the horses. He checked the fence line on the north pasture. He drank his coffee black and too hot standing in the barn doorway, watching the light come up over the mesa in colors that never got old regardless of how many thousand mornings you had watched it happen. 2 of the younger hands, a boy named Cruz and another named Thomas, arrived at the usual time and began their work without needing direction. Jacob had trained them well. They were good boys. He felt a particular fondness for them that he would not have known how to articulate and so never attempted to. At 10 in the morning, a rider came to the ranch. He was one of Denton Cole's men. Jacob recognized the brand on the horse before he recognized the man's face. He was young, nervous in a way he was trying to hide, and he carried a folded piece of paper that he handed to Jacob with the careful formality of someone who has been given specific instructions about the delivery. Jacob read the paper without expression. It was, in the loose language of men who wanted to intimidate without yet committing to open threat, a notice. It informed Clara Whitmore that the competing claim on the eastern 40 acres had been reviewed by a party Jacob understood to mean Denton Cole's father's lawyers and that she had 72 hours to present counter-documentation or vacate the disputed land pending legal resolution. The language was smooth. The message underneath the language was not. Jacob folded the paper carefully along its original creases. "Tell Mr. Cole," he said to the rider, in a voice so completely without emotion that the young man leaned slightly back in his saddle, "that Mrs. Whitmore has received his message." The rider nodded and turned his horse quickly, perhaps more quickly than he had intended, and rode back toward town. Jacob stood in the yard holding the folded paper. Cruz appeared at his elbow. "Trouble?" the boy asked. "Probably," Jacob said. He walked to the house. He knocked at the front door, which he always did regardless of how many years he had worked there, because there were cateses that mattered. Clara answered it with flour on her hands and read the paper he gave her with the steady eyes of a woman who had expected something like this. 72 hours, she said. Yes. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Between them passed the kind of communication that requires no words because words would only be a slower version of what is already understood. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Jacob took his hat from his head. He turned it once in his hands. That slow, deliberate turning that Clara had learned meant he was organizing his thoughts into the order he wanted them in before he spoke. "Tonight," he said, "I'm going into town." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Should I be worried?" Jacob considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Not about me," he said. He put his hat back on. He walked back toward the barn, and Clara stood in her doorway watching him go, with flour on her hands and the paper in her fist, feeling that same thing she had felt the night before, that deep, quiet, certain safety, mixed now with something else. Something that felt almost like sorrow, because she was a perceptive woman, and she understood, watching Jacob walk back to his barn with that particular straightness in his bent back, that tonight something was going to end. She didn't know exactly what. She didn't know exactly how. But she understood that the man walking away from her had spent 11 years building a wall around something, and that Denton Cole and his father and their lawyers and their borrowed authority had, through their greed and their carelessness and their absolute failure to understand what they were dealing with, just knocked that wall down. What lived behind it was walking back into the world now. And redemption. Texas had no idea what was coming. The sun had been down for 2 hours when Jacob Hale rode into town. He had dressed with the same quiet deliberateness that he brought to everything. The dark shirt, clean and pressed, that Clara had once told him suited him. His good boots, not the worn working pair but the other ones, kept wrapped in cloth under his bunk for occasions that in 11 years had never quite arrived until now. His hat, brushed free of dust. And beneath his coat, riding in the twin holsters that had been oiled and fitted and waiting in that wooden box like patient old soldiers, the Colts. He tied his horse at the rail 2 buildings down from the saloon. Not directly in front. Old habit. The kind that 11 years of peaceful living had not managed to extinguish, because some habits are not really habits at all. They are survival, wearing habits clothing. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the cold night air and looked at the saloon. Light spilled from its windows onto the dirt street in warm yellow rectangles. Sound spilled with it. Voices, laughter, the irregular percussion of a piano being played by someone who was either very drunk or had simply made peace with his limitations. Jacob listened to the laughter. He thought about Clara's face in the lamplight at dinner. He thought about the paper in her hand, the flour on her fingers, the careful steadiness of her eyes that cost her more than she would ever say out loud. He thought about Robert Whitmore driving to the county office in the early snow, filing his documentation properly, doing everything right, and some man in an office somewhere deciding that right and wrong were negotiable commodities when enough money was involved. He pushed open the saloon doors and walked inside. The laughter didn't stop immediately. That was the thing about moments like this. They didn't announce themselves. The world didn't pause and draw attention to its own turning points. Jacob walked through the doors, and for the first 3 seconds nothing changed because nobody had yet registered that something was different. The piano kept playing. The conversations kept conversating. The glasses kept meeting the bar with their small percussive reports. Then, one by one, like candles being cupped by an invisible hand, things went quiet. It moved through the room from the door outward, a ripple of silence following Jacob as he walked to the bar. Not because anyone could have said precisely what was wrong, but because the body knows things the mind hasn't processed yet. And the bodies in that room were registering something about the way this man moved that their minds were still working to catch up with. He didn't walk like an old hired hand. He walked like something else entirely. Something that had been folded up and put away for a very long time and had now been taken out and unfolded and was revealed in its full dimensions to be considerably larger than the space it had been occupying. The bartender, a decent man named Osgood who had worked the bar for 15 years and had a reliable instinct for trouble, looked at Jacob and set down the glass he was drying with the careful deliberateness of a man who wants both hands free. "Evening," Jacob said. "Evening," Osgood said. "Denton Cole," Jacob said. Not a question. Osgood's eyes moved, just briefly, just once, to the back corner of the room. Jacob didn't follow the look. He didn't need to. "I'll take a coffee if you have it," Jacob said. Osgood blinked. "Coffee? Black? Hot as you've got it." Denton Cole had seen Jacob come in. He was 26 years old and had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's weak chin and the particular brand of confidence that grows in young men who have been told yes by everyone around them for so long that the concept of no has become essentially theoretical. He was sitting at the corner table with two of his regular companions, a thick-necked man named Burrell and a lean, watchful one named Sykes, and a fourth man that Jacob clocked immediately as different from the others. The fourth man was a professional. Jacob recognized it the way a musician recognizes another musician across a crowded room, not from any single obvious sign but from the accumulation of small things. The way he sat with his back to the wall, the quality of his stillness, the position of his right hand relative to the pistol on his hip, resting near but not on, the way a man rests his hand near a tool he knows how to use. Denton Cole had been a busy boy. He had imported some insurance. Jacob drank his coffee. It was, as it happened, excellent coffee. Osgood had always taken the coffee seriously, which Jacob respected. He drank it slowly and let the room recalibrate around his presence and waited for the thing that always happened in situations like this. The thing as reliable as weather, as inevitable as the sun going down. Denton Cole stood up. He crossed the room with the rolling walk of a man performing confidence for an audience, his two companions rising and following at the natural distance of men who have done this before. The professional at the table stayed seated. That was interesting. That meant Cole had given him specific instructions. Wait, watch, and if necessary, finish it. Cole stopped 10 feet from Jacob, the distance of a man who wants to dominate a conversation but has left himself enough room to reconsider. Well, Cole said, loudly enough for the room to hear. The widow's scarecrow. Didn't expect you to have the nerve. The room was silent enough now that the piano player had stopped, not from any instruction but from the simple animal awareness that this was a moment that required quiet. Jacob set his coffee cup down on the bar. He turned around slowly and looked at Denton Cole with those pale gray eyes and said nothing. Cole's smile held but required more effort than it had a moment ago. You got something to say, old man? Or did she send you in here to beg? Nobody sent me, Jacob said. His voice was the same as always, level, unhurried, with that quality of absolute certainty that made it feel less like speech and more like weather announcement. I came to tell you something. Is that right? Cole crossed his arms. Behind him, Burrell and Sykes shifted their weight in the way that men shift weight when they are preparing for something. The documentation you made disappear, Jacob said. The filing Robert Whitmore made in November 11 years ago. I was there. I am a living witness to that filing, and I will testify to it in front of any judge in this territory. He paused. The claim your father's lawyers filed is fraudulent. You know it. I know it. And by tomorrow morning, the territorial judge in San Angelo will know it too, because I am going to ride to his house tonight and knock on his door. The smile left Cole's face entirely. You're going to ride to San Angelo, he said flatly. After I'm done here, Jacob said. Cole stayed at him. The room held its breath. Something was happening that the room couldn't quite name yet. A shift in the atmosphere, a recalibration of the understood order of things. Cole had expected fear, or pleading, or the shuffling deference of an old man outgunned and outclassed. He had not expected this. He didn't have a prepared response to this. So he did what men do when they don't have a prepared response. He reached for something cruder. Sykes, he said. Sykes moved. He was fast, for an ordinary man. His hand dropped to his gun with the practiced speed of someone who had used it before on people who hadn't been able to adequately respond. He was reaching. The gun was clearing the holster, and Jacob's hands moved. Afterward, the men who were in the saloon that night would describe it in different ways depending on their facility with language and their relationship with what they had actually seen. Osgood, who was perhaps the most reliable witness by virtue of his position directly behind the bar and his professional habit of observation, said simply that he did not see Jacob draw. He saw Jacob's hands at his sides, and then he saw Jacob's hands with both Colts raised and cocked, and it was as if the intervening action had occurred in a dimension not available to ordinary human perception. The sound of two hammers being cocked in a silent room is extraordinary. It is a small sound, mechanically speaking. A click, essentially. Two clicks, simultaneous, the cleanest and most precise punctuation that a certain kind of sentence can have. But in the silence of that saloon, those two clicks landed like the tolling of a church bell. They filled the room completely. They rearranged everything. Sykes froze. His gun was halfway out of the holster, and his brain had just delivered him information that his body was struggling to process, that the old man across the bar had both guns drawn and leveled before Sykes had cleared leather, and that this was not supposed to be possible. Burrell had not moved at all. Burrell, it turned out, had better instincts than Sykes. In the corner, the professional sat very still with his right hand exactly where it had been and his eyes on Jacob with an expression that had moved through surprise and arrived somewhere that looked almost like recognition. He made no move toward his weapon. He was a professional, and professionals perform accurate assessments, and his assessment of the situation had been performed and its conclusion reached in approximately the same time it had taken Jacob to draw. He picked up his whiskey glass with 2 fingers and set it down again and looked at the table. He was done. Cole stood in the middle of the room with both of Jacob's Colts pointed at the people flanking him, and his face had undergone a complete transformation. The confidence was gone, not diminished, but entirely absent. The way of fire is entirely absent once it's been put out. What was left was something younger and considerably less composed. Jacob looked at him steadily. "Tell your father," Jacob said, in the same level voice, the same unhurried certainty, "that the Whitmore land is not for sale and not for taking. Tell him that I will be in San Angelo tomorrow morning. Tell him that if anyone sets foot on that ranch with anything other than good intentions, I will consider it a conversation that needs finishing." He paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Cole's mouth opened. Closed. "Yes," he said. It came out smaller than he intended. "Good," Jacob said. He uncocked both Colts with the same simultaneous, unhurried precision and replaced them beneath his coat in a motion so practiced it looked like breathing. He turned back to the bar. He picked up his coffee cup. He finished what was left of it in one long drink and set the cup down with a small, final sound. He put 2 coins on the bar for Osgood. "Good coffee," he said. Osgood nodded once, slowly, like a man in a dream. Jacob walked back through the saloon toward the doors. The crowd parted for him, not dramatically, not with the theatrical scrambling of a dime novel, but in the natural, inevitable way that water parts around something solid and certain. Nobody spoke. The piano player did not resume playing. At the doors, Jacob paused. He didn't turn around. "Mr. Cole," he said. "Silence." "Laugh again," Jacob said quietly, "and I'll take it personally." He pushed through the doors and walked out into the cold redemption night. He rode to San Angelo that night as he had said he would, arriving at the territorial judge's home at 4 in the morning and knocking with the calm certainty of a man who has calculated that what he is doing is worth the inconvenience he is causing. The judge, a sharp-minded man named Aldridge who had presided over enough frontier law to have developed reliable instincts about who was wasting his time and who was not, listened to Jacob's testimony for 20 minutes, asked 4 precise questions, and issued a written declaration suspending the competing claim pending full review by morning light. The claim was dismissed 11 days later. The documentation, when properly searched for, was found. Someone in the county office had misfiled it. Accidentally, they said, though the word accidentally carried the particular hollowness it carries when nobody believes it and nobody can prove otherwise. Cole's father made no further moves on the Whitmore land. The professional gunman left Redemption the morning after the saloon and was not seen again. Denton Cole himself became, in the way of men who are humiliated by the accurate revelation of their own limitations, considerably quieter. He still sat on the saloon steps on Saturday evenings. He did not call out to people in the street anymore. 3 weeks after the night in the saloon, Clara found Jacob in the barn on a Sunday evening, sitting on his bunk with a wooden box open beside him. He was cleaning the Colts with the same methodical attention he gave to everything, oil and cloth and the slow, patient work of maintenance. She leaned in the doorway and watched him for a moment. "Are you going to tell me?" she asked. He didn't look up from his work. "Tell you what?" "Who you were," she said. "Before." He was quiet for a long time. The lantern light moved softly over the walls. Outside, the wind was doing its usual thing with the mesquite trees. "A man who made a lot of mistakes," he said finally, and then stopped. Clara was quiet, considering this. "And now," she asked. Jacob looked up at her then. In the warm light, his face was the face she knew, worn and weathered and carrying its history the way good land carries its history, in its depth and its patience and its willingness to keep producing something worth having. "Now I work your land," he said, "and I'd like to keep doing that, if you will have me." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed off the door frame and walked inside the barn and sat down in the old chair across from his bunk that had been there so long it had worn grooves in the floor from its own weight. "Put those away," she said, nodding at the Colts, "and come have supper." Jacob looked at the guns in his hands. He cleaned the second one to completion, because he was Jacob Hale and things were done correctly or not at all, then wrapped them in their old cloth and closed the box and latched it and slid it back under the floorboard. He stood up. He took his hat from the nail on the wall. "Clara," he said. She had started toward the door, but she stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for the 11 years. She turned and looked at him with those steady, perceptive eyes that had never missed a thing in all the time he had known her. "Jacob," she said, "there are going to be 11 more." She walked out of the barn ahead of him into the clean, cold evening, and after a moment he followed her, and the barn door swung closed behind them, both on a hinge he had repaired so many years ago that neither of them remembered a time when it had been broken. Above the Whitmore land, the stars were out in their full and indifferent thousands, the same stars that had watched over redemption since before it had a name, and would watch over it long after every person in it had been folded back into the ground. But tonight, in the warm yellow light of Clara Whitmore's kitchen window, two people were sitting down to supper, and the old hired hand was home. And